Have you ever heard a group of Israeli soldiers reciting the Our Father in fluent Tagalog? Not Hebrew, not English, but the same words Filipino children whisper before bed, the same prayer old women murmur while clutching a rosary in the dim light of dawn. At first, it sounds like a joke, a strange experiment, maybe even a misunderstanding. But then you see their faces, young, sunburnt, carrying the weight of a country at war, and you realize they mean every word. It began with a photograph, a simple one. No grand military parade, no political handshake, no headline-worthy explosion. Just a row of boys barely past their teenage years, heads bowed, lips moving in unison, their rifles leaning quietly against the wall behind them. At the center, a young woman in a modest dress stood with a small wooden cross in her hand. She wasn't a soldier. She wasn't Israeli. She was Filipino. And her presence, and her language, had somehow made its way deep into the heart of a desert thousands of kilometers away from Manila. When I first heard about it, I thought maybe it was just a one-off cultural exchange, like those friendly visits countries do for good PR. But the more I dug, the more I found myself caught in a story I couldn't shake. This wasn't about politics, not entirely. It wasn't even about religion in the way you might expect. It was about survival, and the strange ways faith travels across oceans, planting roots where no one would think to look. Her name was Maria. Born in Pampanga, raised in a small barangay where Sundays meant walking to church in your best clothes, even if those clothes were patched at the knees. She'd never been outside the Philippines until she married a man she met online, an Israeli farmer who had visited Cebu years earlier. Love pulled her across continents, but it was war that gave her a different purpose. Her new home wasn't the postcard version of Israel you see in travel brochures. It was a frontier town near the Gaza border, where air raid sirens were as common as birdsong, and the dust carried stories of battles fought long before she was born. Maria didn't set out to teach anyone how to pray in Tagalog. In fact, in those first years, she spoke her mother tongue only when calling home. But something changed one night when the sirens blared, and she found herself huddled in a shelter with a group of very young soldiers, boys who had been sent to protect the town. Their hands were trembling, their eyes darting at every sound outside. Maria noticed the smallest one, no more than 19, his lips moving silently. She asked him what he was saying. He told her it was a Hebrew prayer his grandmother taught him, but the words felt distant, like they belonged to another life. Without thinking, Maria began to recite the Amanamin. Her voice was low, almost drowned out by the hum of the shelter's ventilation. But one by one, the soldiers leaned closer. They didn't understand the words, but something in the rhythm, the rise and fall of her voice, stilled their breathing. When she finished, the 19-year-old whispered, "Can you teach us?" It started small. One line a day. Sometimes they'd repeat after her, stumbling over syllables like children learning their first words. Other times, they'd just listen. But weeks passed, and the lines became verses. The verses became a whole prayer. And one day Maria realized these young men, trained for war, now spoke her language more gently than some people back home. I remember asking her why she thought they wanted to learn. She said, "When you're far from home, it doesn't matter if the prayer belongs to you. Sometimes you just need words that feel safe." That answer stayed with me. What's remarkable is that it didn't stay inside that shelter. Soon, on the edge of drills and patrols, you'd hear them, not shouting commands, but murmuring a Filipino prayer. It baffled the senior officers at first, but even they noticed something. The boys who prayed this way seemed calmer, more focused, as if the words carried a shield you couldn't see. And here's where the story turns from curious to extraordinary, because in a world where religion is often used to divide, this quiet blending of faiths became an unspoken pact between two cultures who, on paper, had no reason to share such intimacy. The truth is, I wasn't sure how to feel when I first saw the video of them. It was touching, yes, but also strange. Why Tagalog? Why not English, which they already knew? Why not Hebrew, their own sacred language? But maybe that's the point. Maybe it's precisely because it was foreign that it became precious. Maria never sought recognition. In fact, when an Israeli news outlet came to interview her, she almost refused. She worried people would misunderstand, that they'd think she was trying to convert anyone. But she wasn't. She was giving them something else. A thread to hold on to in the dark. And this is where our journey begins. Because what happened next would take Maria far beyond that dusty border town into a chapter of her life she never imagined. And it would all start with a single prayer in a language not their own. Maria's life before Israel had been as far from war as you could imagine. Pampanga was a place where mornings began with the smell of pan de sal and the sound of a neighbor's rooster, where the loudest arguments were over the best halo stand, and where danger felt like something that happened somewhere else. To someone else. She grew up in a family that measured wealth not in money, but in the number of relatives who showed up for Sunday lunch. By the time she was 24, she thought she knew what her future would look like. Work a steady job, maybe teach at the local school, raise children in the same barangay where she learned to ride a bike. When she met Eli, the Israeli farmer who would later become her husband, she expected an adventure, not a war zone. He had visited the Philippines for a friend's wedding, and in those weeks, Maria noticed how he was both fascinated by and awkward with her culture. He was the kind of man who bowed when introduced to elders, but held his spoon the wrong way. They kept in touch, first through playful video calls, then through letters that turned serious. When he asked her to join him in Israel, she imagined open fields, olive trees, maybe even a small cafe by the coast. She did not imagine underground shelters or the thud of distant artillery shaking the window panes at night. Her first months in Israel were a tangle of contradictions. Eli's family welcomed her warmly, teaching her to bake challah bread and inviting her to Sabbath dinners, where conversation flowed as fast as the wine. But beyond the family table, she felt the weight of eyes, some curious, some cautious. In the market, people would sometimes switch to English for her benefit, but she caught herself missing the playful rhythm of Kapampangan, the comfort of hearing jeepney drivers shout out stops. It wasn't homesickness exactly. It was something quieter, a sense of being adrift between two worlds. The first moment that shifted something inside her happened on a Friday evening, during her 3rd month in Israel. Eli's grandmother, a small woman with hands like paper, invited her to light the Sabbath candles. Maria hesitated, unsure if it was proper. But when the old woman smiled and placed a matchstick in her hand, Maria lit the wicks and whispered a silent prayer in Tagalog, the same one her own mother had taught her. No one else understood it, but in that small moment, she realized faith didn't always need translation. The second moment came weeks later, on a bus ride to the nearby city. It was a warm afternoon, and the bus was crowded with soldiers returning from their service. They were loud, teasing each other, half asleep in their uniforms. One boy, sitting across from her, was quietly reading a small booklet. She noticed the way his lips moved as he read, the crease between his brows. Without thinking, she asked what it was. He looked up, surprised by her accent, and told her it was a psalm his mother had sent him. Then, almost shyly, he asked, "Do you also pray?" She nodded. "In my language," she replied. The boy smiled, Not the polite smile of a stranger, but something warmer, as if they had shared a secret neither could explain. The third moment was the one that stayed with her the longest. It was late at night, sirens had gone off again, and she found herself in the shelter with a handful of soldiers. The air was heavy with dust and exhaustion. Someone asked her to sing. At first she shook her head, embarrassed. But the youngest soldier, the same boy who would later ask to learn the amanamin, kept insisting. So she began softly, choosing a hymn her father used to sing while fixing fishing nets by the river. The melody was simple, almost like a lullaby. By the time she reached the last line, the soldiers were silent, their shoulders no longer tense. One of them whispered, "It's peaceful." She didn't know it then, but that was the night the lessons would begin. Maria didn't think of herself as a teacher. She didn't arrive in Israel with the idea of changing anyone. She came expecting to adapt, to learn their ways, to fit into their traditions. But the more time she spent in that border town, the more she realized that what she carried from home wasn't just her language. It was a way of seeing the world, a way of speaking to God that had been shaped by centuries of storms and survival in the islands. At first, she thought the soldiers were just humoring her, picking up a few Tagalog phrases out of politeness. But one day, as they were patrolling the town, she heard one of them quietly recite the first lines of the amanamin to himself, almost like a charm. She didn't interrupt. She simply walked beside him, the desert wind lifting the hem of her dress, and felt a strange swell of pride. In the quiet moments between drills and alarms, she began to see them differently. They were not just soldiers, not just faces in uniform. They were sons who missed their mothers, brothers who carried the laughter of childhood in their eyes, young men whose bravery was tested every single day. And somehow, by teaching them her prayer, she was giving them a small piece of shelter they could carry anywhere, even into the chaos. Maria would later say that those early months in Israel were when her own vision began to change. She had thought survival meant hardening yourself, keeping your head down, protecting your own heart. But these boys, with their clumsy Tagalog and earnest questions, taught her something else. That sometimes survival is not about closing yourself off, but about opening a door for someone else to step inside. And slowly, almost without noticing, she began to prepare for the moment when that door would swing wide, when the prayer would leave the shelter and carry her into a chapter she never planned for. The first time Maria realized things had changed for good, it wasn't during a prayer. It was in the middle of a sandstorm. The wind whipped through the streets like an angry tide, rattling the tin roofs and slamming shutters against walls. Most people stayed inside, but the soldiers had to move, patrolling the edge of town. She had gone out to bring them hot tea, her shawl pulled tight against the grit in the air. That's when she heard it. Faint at first, carried on the wind. Not Hebrew commands, not the crackle of radios, but the unmistakable cadence of Tagalog. They were reciting the Ama Namin, their voices steady even as the storm howled around them. It stopped her in her tracks. These boys, who had once laughed over every mispronounced syllable, were now speaking the words with the same gravity she had grown up hearing in church. It was no longer just a borrowed prayer. It had become theirs. Word spread quickly. In small towns like theirs, news didn't need newspapers. It lived in whispers and sideways glances. Some neighbors found it beautiful, even moving. "They're learning from her," one woman told Eli, "and maybe she's learning from them too." Others were less certain. "Why teach them your prayer?" an older man asked Maria one afternoon at the market. "They have their own." She didn't argue. She only smiled and said, "Sometimes a prayer isn't about where it comes from. It's about where it goes." Still, the attention grew. A local reporter came to take pictures, and soon the story appeared in an Israeli community paper. The article was simple, almost understated, a Filipina teaching soldiers a Catholic prayer in Tagalog. But it was enough to spark curiosity. A few days later, Maria began receiving messages from strangers, some thanking her, others asking why she would share something so personal with people so far from her homeland. She didn't know how to explain it in writing, so she kept her replies short, never trying to convince anyone. But the soldiers, they understood without explanation. For them, the prayer had become more than words. It was a thread that tied them to something calm, something far from the chaos of their daily lives. One boy told her it reminded him of his mother's singing voice. Another said it made him dream of oceans, though he had never seen one. There was one soldier, in particular, Avi, who seemed most deeply moved by the lessons. He was 21, tall, with a smile that could disarm even the grumpiest shopkeeper. At first he was shy about speaking in Tagalog, often mumbling through the lines, but over time he began to lead the others, correcting their pronunciation, even asking Maria for the meaning of each phrase. One night, after a long patrol, he stayed behind as the others left. "Maria," he said quietly, "I think I pray differently now. Before, I just asked God for things. Now, I think I'm listening more." That was the moment she realized something irreversible had happened. This was no longer a small, private habit in a shelter. It was reshaping the way these young men approached their faith, their fears, even each other. And with that realization came a weight she had not felt before, the weight of responsibility. Then came the invitation. An officer approached her one afternoon with a request. Would she be willing to lead a short prayer before the entire unit during the next community event? Maria froze. She was not a leader, at least not in the public sense. She was just someone who had shared a piece of herself in a quiet corner of the world. But Eli encouraged her. "They're asking because you've given them something," he said. "Now they want to share it with everyone." On the evening of the event, the town square glowed under strings of yellow lights. Families gathered with food, children chased each other between the tables, and soldiers stood in small clusters, their rifles slung loosely at their sides. When Maria stepped up to the small platform, her knees trembled. She looked out at the faces, so many young ones, so many eyes that had seen too much, and for a moment she forgot every word. Then Avi stepped forward and gave her a small nod. It was enough. She began slowly, letting the words find their rhythm. "Ama namin, sumasalangit ka." The soldiers answered in unison, their voices strong and clear. The sound filled the square, spilling into the streets beyond. People stopped what they were doing. Even those who didn't understand the language seemed to sense its weight. When it was over, the square was silent for a heartbeat, as if everyone was holding the same breath. Then came the applause. Not loud, not frantic, but steady, almost reverent. Maria felt her eyes sting. She had thought she was simply teaching them a prayer, but in that moment, she understood she had been building something else entirely. A bridge. Of course, bridges can be fragile. Not everyone approved. A letter arrived a week later from a distant relative back home, asking why she was mixing prayers with people of another faith. Maria read it twice, then folded it carefully and placed it in a drawer. She didn't have the energy to defend herself. Instead, she returned to the shelter the next day, greeted by the sound of soldiers practicing the prayer before their patrol. Whatever the world thought, she knew what it meant to them and to her. It was in those days that Maria began to see her own life differently. She had come to Israel expecting to adapt, to be shaped by the land and its people. But she had also shaped them in ways she could not have predicted. And somewhere in the quiet between sirens, in the laughter between lessons, she realized she was no longer just a guest in this place. She was part of its story now, and the story was far from over. It happened on a night so still that Maria thought the sirens might never come. The air was cool, the stars sharp and bright over the desert, and Eli had just stepped out to check the gates. She was brewing ginger tea when the sound split the air, that long, rising wail she had learned to dread. She dropped everything and ran to the shelter. Inside, the soldiers were already gathering. Some were pulling on gear, others speaking into radios, their faces tight. The ground shuddered with the impact of something far away, but close enough to feel in her bones. Maria sat down on the bench, her hands gripping each other, willing her breathing to steady. That was when Avi walked in. His uniform was dusty, his helmet slightly askew, but his eyes met hers, and for a moment she saw no fear, only resolve. Without speaking, he knelt in front of her and began softly, "Ama namin, sumasalangit ka." The others, still moving, still preparing, began to join in. One by one, the voices wove together, filling the shelter with a sound that felt impossibly calm against the chaos outside. Maria's voice caught at first, but then she found her place in the prayer. The sirens kept wailing, the ground trembled again, but inside that shelter, it felt as if the world had slowed. Even those who didn't know the words kept still, listening. Maria realized that for the first time, the prayer wasn't hers to lead. It belonged to them now. Minutes later, orders came. Half the soldiers moved out, disappearing into the night, while the others stayed behind. Maria sat in silence with those who remained, the taste of ginger and dust in her mouth. She thought about the letter from her relative back home, about the skeptical looks in the market, about all the reasons someone might think this was wrong. And yet, in that moment, she knew with certainty it was right. The attack ended quickly, though no one would call it easy. There were injuries, but no lives lost. By dawn, the soldiers returned, exhausted but alive. Avi was among them, his arm in a sling but smiling. He walked straight to her and said simply, "Your prayer kept me steady." Maria didn't answer right away. She only nodded, feeling the weight of his words settle deep inside her. This was why she had stayed, why she had shared something so deeply personal with strangers in a strange land. It wasn't about converting anyone or about blending traditions into something new. It was about giving them and herself something unshakable to hold on to when the ground trembled. Weeks later, Maria returned to the Philippines for the first time since her wedding. Her hometown hadn't changed much. The same church bells, the same market stalls, the same children running barefoot down the road. But she carried something new with her. In her bag was a small video clip that the soldiers had sent after she left. It showed them, in full uniform, standing in a line at sunrise, reciting the Ama Namin in Tagalog before starting their day. She showed the video to her mother, who watched quietly, her lips pressed together. When it ended, the old woman turned to Maria and said, "Anak, you brought our prayer where it had never gone before." That night, lying in her childhood room, Maria thought about the strange, winding path her life had taken, from the rice fields of Pampanga to the borderlands of Israel, from learning to live in another language to teaching hers in the unlikeliest of places. She thought about the boys in uniform, about Avi, about the way their voices had filled the shelter that night. And she realized something she hadn't been able to put into words until now. Home is not just a place you return to. Sometimes it's a place you build, even in the middle of a desert, even among people who speak a different tongue, even under the shadow of war. When she returned to Israel, the soldiers greeted her like family. One of them handed her a small wooden rosary he had carved himself, the beads rough but beautiful. "We thought you should have this," he said. "It's from all of us." Maria held it in her palm, feeling the ridges, the weight. And in that moment she understood. This prayer, these connections, this bridge she had built, they were no longer hers alone. They belonged to everyone who had spoken the words in the dark and found a little more light. And so life continued. The sirens still came, the drills still broke the quiet, the desert wind still carried dust into every corner of the town. But now, between all of that, there was also something else, a shared heartbeat in the form of a prayer from a faraway island, spoken in a language that had crossed an ocean to find a home, in the voices of strangers who had become something more. And in the quiet moments, when Maria heard those words rise from young voices she had once found trembling, she would close her eyes and think, maybe this is what peace sounds like. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs a reminder that kindness knows no borders. Leave a comment below. What does this prayer mean to you? And if you want more stories that honor the Filipino spirit in unexpected places, subscribe and join our community. Your voice empui aun ay